those who are unable to attend. So welcome. I know that we have a lot of community members in the audience today, board members, members of our faculty and staff, as well as stakeholders from the 3 municipalities that we serve as a school district. The intent of today's webinar is to provide the executive summary of a demographic analysis and enrollment projection study that we have worked with in collaboration with SLAM to be able to bring to the community. Special thanks to our Board of Education and leadership in our in Hopewell Township, who have helped partner with us to bring you this executive summary and analysis, and who will also be working with us to make sure that we are planning for any increases that this causes to our student populations. This is a very exciting time. The district has been seeing some declining enrollment over the years. It's exciting to see opportunities for folks to come in and into our community and bring young folks into our community. And it's going to take some planning. So though this is a preliminary report and it's early on in the process, we do need to do that planning early, right? Because as the earlier we get started in planning and reacting to the new folks that are coming in, the better that we will be to make sure that our programs, the integrity of our programs are maintained, and that we are working closely with the school community to make sure that we're providing the education that we've become used to here in Hopewell. Before I pass it off to our board secretary and BA who will introduce our presenters today, I see Anita Williams-Galliano is here. Madam Board President, would you like to share any opening thoughts before we jump in?
I would just keep my comments brief. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to present to the community. And as you said, it's a very exciting time for us as a community, as well as a school district, to know that we have new families joining us and just to understand what we need to do to prepare for them and prepare for more children. And so I'm just really pleased to be planning ahead and to be with you this evening. So thank you all.
Thank you. We will provide time at the end for a Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A section. We've disabled the chat to make sure that we capture all the questions in one area. We will make sure that we answer as many as we can tonight, but if we run out of time, we want to make sure that we put out a FAQ sheet with answers to the questions we don't get to, and even put out answers to the ones that we did for those who were not able to attend tonight. So that with that being said, I'm going to pass the mic off to Mr. Calavita, who will introduce our presenters for this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Treese. Just wanted to, before we get started, just wanted to let everyone know this demographic study was started off with an RFP process, a request for proposal process, where we solicited responses from several firms, both in New Jersey and out of New Jersey. We had an interview process, and we decided to move ahead with this firm, SLAM, due to we like the way the presentation looked. It's a different type of presentation. It's a more graphical, so folks can get right into understanding what they're trying to say. They've also done work in other communities within New Jersey, most notably our sister community of Princeton. So without further ado, I will introduce Mike and Pat from SLAM to get the process started. Guys.
Thank you, Bob. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Zuba. I'm the Director of Public Ed Master Planning with the SLAM Collaborative. With me is Pat Gallagher. He's our planning manager at the SLAM Collaborative. So those who may not know us, SLAM's a architecture and design firm with one of our areas of practice is K-12 public education. We do an extensive amount of demographic enrollment projections as well as long-range facility plans. Not only in the state of New Jersey, but also throughout the really throughout the East Coast and the Northeast corridor. With that, I'll jump right into tonight. We do have about 25 slides, and we will be giving plenty of time for Q&A at the end, as well as a follow-up with the FAQ. So if there's any questions, just note maybe the slide number or the content, and that'll help us really be able to answer that. So as part of tonight's executive summary presentation, we'll start going through the enrollment drivers, then partway through I'll pass the baton off to Pat to do his share of the presentation. So as part of any demographic study, you always begin at the bigger, much larger picture, and that includes the overall population trends. And what we're showing on this slide is just a look back, going all the way back to 1960, examining the total population of Hopewell Township, the borough, as well as Pennington Borough, and how that has matured and changed over time. I think what I really try to focus on is not really the historic growth, but really looking over the last decade or so. So using the census data from 2010 to 2020, you could see that there has been a little bit of growth. However, it's not the growth that was experienced, say, 30 or 40 years ago. Within this time period, it was an overall growth of about 2%, with the borough experiencing the greatest amount of growth at just over 8%, followed by the township at 1.1%. I will note, and we've been noting this the whole time, that the 2020 census count, based on the timing of the fielding of it, was right at the onset of the pandemic. So as we'll reference later on, these uptick in housing sales and trends with new people moving into our communities, that really does not get captured in that census count. So this is really that point in time, almost really right at the onset of the pandemic. So we do recognize that a lot of the real estate activity has definitely changed that number, but we don't have a more concrete number put out by the U.S. government since then. Taking a look at our demographic profile for the entire district, and that includes the really all of the different cohorts, and the way these are broken down, and you'll see the chart on the right-hand side with the green bars and those 5-year cohorts indicating those cohorts that grew, whereas the red bars are indicating those cohorts that have shrunk. Where we're seeing the greatest population or the greatest growth is really in those over 55 cohorts, as many of our communities in the Northeast and in the East age in place. We see growth across the board in those 55 plus individuals. That does get offset by a decline in those in the 40 to 54-year-olds. Those are individuals that are likely to have older school-age children or children who have recently graduated and have moved on. We're also seeing a decrease in the population of 5 to 14-year-olds. With this, I will caveat that this is census data, and when we look at school-age population with census data, it does include students outside of Hopewell Valley Regional Schools. So this does count those children that attend either parochial, private, or for some reason other public schools. That last bullet point is an important one because females of childbearing age, there was a slight decline there of just under 8%. That's a good indicator of your future births, and that has a bearing on births that have not happened yet. Pat, on the next slide, we'll begin segueing right into the birth trends overall. So I think doing any demographic report and doing any enrollment projections, the greatest indicator for your future kindergarten is looking back at what those birth cohorts look like 5 and 6 years earlier. So really that gives us good insight of likely what your kindergarten classes are going to look like. You could see going way back to 2000 was your really last historic peak of births at just over 260. And then what we saw was a pretty large decline over a number of years, getting down to where births really kind of bottomed out around that 130 or so mark. And, you know, I'm referring to births, but I'm referring to births from all 3 communities that feed into the district. Between 2010 and 2020, births began to go through a little bit of a period of stabilization. We had some ups and downs overall, but then really with the pandemic and what we saw in many of the communities that we've been working in since then is that 2021, we saw a birth increase. That birth increase went up to just over 180. That brings us back to really the early 2000s of when the last time births were at that level. And then using preliminary data and some methods to estimate that, we're looking at 2022 to be about 170 births overall total. So these are going to be feeding into those kindergarten projections as we begin talking about later, which Pat will cover. All right, looking at housing permit activity, and I will say this is separate from the fair share housing, which we'll touch on later on. But this really takes a look back of about 18 or 19 years to look at the historic growth pattern. And back in the early 2000s, you could see based on the stacked bar chart, we had a fair number of single family as well as multifamily developments. However, over the last several years, that number has declined to just over 24 permits annually. And most of that has been in the single family market. We've had some years that are higher and obviously some years that are lower, but that's really looking at what that background growth from a new residential development standpoint has been outside of the fair share housing, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Taking a look at the home sale trends overall, and this is data that we get through a third-party provider through the Auto Group. It's always important to look at a point in time prior to the pandemic, because we do know that has seen some elevated sales levels. So going back to 2019, about 400 sales, about 75% of those overall in Hopewell Township. Then moving into the pandemic years of 2020 and 2021, we saw those sales increase to over 480, with increases really across the board in all three communities there, even though we do recognize that the boroughs are smaller themselves. We have been tracking 2022, and what we do is we take the partial year data because they haven't closed out the sales on the full year, and based on the historic percentage, we're able to then extrapolate or estimate what that would look like. And we did see a bit of a drop off in 2022 due to larger market forces, including inventory, lending rates, as well as just really overall price point increasing. So really looking at that rate of decline, overall getting back down to just over 310 total sales. So a pretty big decline after a bit of a boom in those two pandemic years. Pat, I'll pass it off to you if you want to pick up the baton on the fair share part.
Sounds good. So thanks, Mike. So I want to talk first about the fair share housing obligation under all three municipalities' third round obligations. And a vast majority of the fair share housing obligations are in Hopewell Township, which has about 650 units in its third round agreement. We have a map here that's showing where those projects are located, and they're primarily located in the Bear Tavern district, which is shown in green here. Also have two projects in the Stony Brook district, and then one at the BMS campus in Hopewell. And two of these projects, I will note, are age restricted and are not anticipated to have an impact on school enrollments. However, it's also important to note that these projects, these fair share housing projects, are also part of larger developments that also contain market rate units. I'll get into that in a little bit. Actually, this is a good segue into it now. And so if we take a look at the three major projects that are currently approved within Hopewell Township, it encompasses three of those COA fair share housing sites. We have the largest, Hopewell Park, which is over 1,000 units. And then we have two other projects, Woodmont at Hopewell, apartment project in the Stony Brook attendance zone, and the collection at Hopewell behind the ShopRite Plaza. And that is in Bear Tavern. And what we really noted here is just the sheer number of units. This is a significant growth in the overall inventory within the three municipalities feeding into the district. And if when these projects are completed, that would represent about a 20% increase in the overall housing stock within those three municipalities. When we're looking at impacts to the school system, one of the most important things that we look at are the size of the units. Knowing that studio and one-bedroom units tend to produce very few students. We do see some student populations in two-bedroom units, and then when you start getting into 3- and 4-bedroom units, that's where we really start to see a higher impact in terms of number of students per unit. Overall, about less than 10% of the units are one-bedrooms, about 58% are two-bedrooms, and the remaining third of units are either 3- or 4-bedroom units. And perhaps the biggest trend here as the district continues its planning efforts is the location of the units, where a vast majority of those units, about 83%, are located in the Bear Tavern district. So this map here just shows the location. Again, Bear Tavern being green with the vast majority of those units. Third project in the Stony Brook attendance zone. And so, one of the biggest questions as part of our analysis is what is going to be the impact and student generation at these developments. So going through the site plan submittals We did a peer review of the student generation estimates that were prepared as part of those projects. They used really the industry standard, which is the student multipliers provided by the Rutgers University Center for Policy and Research, and concurred with the findings there that were based on the unit types and the approvals. Overall, we're looking at these units having a population of just under 450 students once all of the projects are completed. A little bit more than half of those in your elementary school, and the remaining students in your middle and high school. Perhaps the most important component of this when we're looking at the district's longer range planning efforts is going to be the timing of these units and how many units come online per year over the next 10 years. We're assuming a 15-year build out period for the Hopewell Park development. And our assumptions are that that will start to issue COs beginning in 2024 and not be completed until 15 years later in 2039. With the other two projects, we're anticipating a 5-year timeline starting in 2024 and completing in 2029 within that 10-year projection horizon. For Hopewell Park, we're anticipating about 60% of those units are going to be captured within our 10-year projections, with the remaining 40% outside of our projection horizon. And we also do understand that there's going to be market forces at play over the coming years that are going to drive the timeline for completion of those units. We understand that with the housing market slowing a little bit, that may extend the timeline for some of these developments. But we also understand that there's always an ebb and flow with the housing market, and while there may be a near-term period where units are produced at a slower pace, that may be followed up by a period with higher production of units. But certainly something for the district to keep in mind as it continues its planning efforts. Getting into our overall enrollment trends, as Dr. Treese had mentioned, over the last 10 years, the district's enrollment has decreased by about 7%, but that rate of decrease hasn't been felt equally across the grade groups, with the elementary enrollment decreasing at only 1%, while the middle and high school decreased by about 11.5% and 13% respectively. And what we've seen over the last 2 years is that there's been an uptick in enrollment where student enrollment has increased by just under 2%, with most of that growth being felt in the elementary school level. Diving into our individual elementary schools, again, while overall enrollment has decreased slowly over the 10-year period, different schools experience different trends. Looking back just at the 5-year trend, Bear Tavern and Tollgate both saw student populations increase, while Stony Brook was relatively stable and Hopewell saw about a 5% decrease. Looking at a 10-year trend, Bear Tavern is really the only school that has seen some pretty sizable growth at about 24% growth, while Tollgate remains stable and Hopewell and Stony Brook experienced modest decreases over that 10-year period. As part of our process, we also do spatial analysis to understand student population patterns within the community. This map just showing student densities for elementary students within your community. We also track student migration into the district, and this is something that uses your student database and identifies students who are new to a district compared to the year prior. What we found is that in the years prior to the pandemic, your new to district students were pretty stable at about 160 per year. And then we saw a pretty dramatic uptick in 2020, and especially the 2021-22 school year, where we increased to about 240. That really aligns with that elevated home sale trend that we saw that Mike presented earlier. This year, this past school year, we saw that new to district number decrease to just under 180. Again, that reflects the home sale trends that we've seen with sales this year trending below what they were the prior to. This map here just showing the concentration of new district students, really reflecting overall density patterns within the community, with the higher density areas within the boroughs and in the Stony Brook attendance zone seeing the highest share of new to district students. We also track net migration at all grade levels. This helps feed into our model. Overall, the elementary grades tend to see net in-migration, so more students moving in than students who move out in any given year. and that's been relatively stable over the last 6 or 7 years. At the middle school, on average, the middle school averages no net migration, so about equal numbers of move-ins and move-outs, although year over year, some schools see net in migration, other schools see net out migration. And at the high school level, net out migration averages about 17 students annually. This is most common, the transition between 8th grade and 9th grade, where students are likely to enroll in private schools. However, that rate has decreased over the last few years and is nearing no net migration. So to get into our projections, we use the industry standard methodology, the cohort survival methodology, which really relies on the baseline projections rely on baseline information, and really the general premise is that the recent past is the best indicator of the near future. And we use growth rates, migration rates that reflect the housing and demographic trends that we've seen over the last 5 to 6 years. And that accounts for all of the various external factors, housing, migration, some level of new development. However, we also recognize that some of the larger projects, in particular, those 3 large projects are not captured in our baseline model. And so we developed housing multipliers based on those Rutgers University student generation rates, which were then added in to the baseline model. Persistency ratios are really the driver of our baseline model. I won't get into too much detail other than pointing out that when a persistency ratio is over 1, that means a cohort grows as it moves to the next grade. And under 1 means that it decreases. And historically, Hopewell Valley Regional School District sees net in-migration, particularly among the non-transition years where those persistency ratios are over 1. And then during transition years is when we tend to see the greatest movement of students out of the district. As Mike mentioned earlier, births are our best indicator of future kindergarten enrollments. And in order to project our last 5 kindergarten classes, we have to prepare birth projections for 2023 through 2027. We use demographic models based on birth rates for Mercer County and the state as a whole, and then used population cohorts from the Census Bureau for 2020 to project females of childbearing age and then births going forward over that period. For our recommended model, we're showing births averaging about 164 annually. So those elevated rates that we've seen over the last 2 years continuing, but at a rate lower than that peak you saw in 2021, but still a bit above where you were in the 10 years prior to 2020. So understanding that the enrollment projections models are really predicated on the underlying assumptions holding true, we always recommend that our clients look at a high, medium, and low scenario, which really represent the range of possible outcomes, knowing that over a 10-year horizon, there's things that we're not going to be able to foresee. And so by preparing the high, medium, and low, we can give the district the range of possible outcomes so that it can consider all 3 as part of its long-range planning efforts. Our medium model is the one that we are recommending as most likely to happen. However, we've also provided a high model, which has more aggressive in-migration rates and a faster build-out of those new housing units, and a low model, which assumes lower levels of student migration and a slower build-out of those new housing units. And as I mentioned before, we understand that in the near term, the pace of some of those new developments may be slowed temporarily due to market conditions. And in that instance, we think the medium and the low are probably both good models to look at least in the near term, while both the low, medium, and high should all be consulted as we get out further into the projections horizon. So this just shows our 3 models district-wide, looking at total enrollment, with the high being in the blue, medium in the green, and low model in the red. The high model is projecting some pretty consistent growth, about 700 students or a 20% increase over the next decade. The medium model is projecting more moderate growth of about 430 students or about 13% growth over the next decade. And the low model It's projecting a more stable enrollment where students generated from the new housing units are largely offsetting kind of a natural decrease in the student population. And so projecting enrollment staying around 3,500 students over the next decade. But overall, we're recommending the medium model as most in line with our underlying demographic and housing analysis. These projections are disaggregated by school and by grade. And it's important to note the differing trends with the different grade cohorts. Elementary enrollment, which is in our blue bars, is projected to see the greatest amount of growth at just over 15%, stabilizing at just over 1,700 students by 2030, and then stabilizing at that rate over the final 3 years of the projections. The middle school enrollment is projected to stay stable in the near term, largely based on existing elementary cohorts, and then growing over the last 5 years in particular as those larger elementary classes move up. And finally, high school enrollment projected to decrease in the near term before rebounding over the final 5 years, and that's in yellow. And we also wanted to highlight the difference between our baseline or natural growth and new students generated from new housing developments. And so this is for the medium model. So assuming no new housing units are built in those 3 major developments, the green bars would represent kind of that natural enrollment projection, where we're projecting some modest growth, largely due to in-migration into the district of about 5%, or about 180 new pre-K through 12 students over a 10-year period. And the red bars indicate the students that we're adding in from those 3 new housing projects. And so, again, this captures about 60% of the units at Hopewell Park, knowing the other 40 are outside of our 10-year window, and all of the units at the Collection and Woodmont. So by year 10, we're anticipating we're adding an additional 250 students from those developments to the projection. And so about 60% of our projected growth is from new housing, and about 40% is that natural growth. Breaking that down by elementary school, we're anticipating the greatest growth within Bear Tavern at about 19%. Followed by Stony Brook at about 16%. Those are the 2 districts that are most impacted by the new housing developments. We're also anticipating some natural growth within the Tollgate attendance zone and some slow growth within the Hopewell attendance zone. Looking out over the final 5 years of the projections, we're projecting stable enrollment at Hopewell and Stony Brook, a small decrease at Tollgate, and a pretty modest increase at Bear Tavern of about 8% as those units at Hopewell Park continue to come online over that period. And again, the impact of housing is evident in all of these projections. At Bear Tavern, about 80% of that growth is due to new housing. At Stony Brook, about 70% of projected growth is due to new housing. And with that, we're
Thank
happy
you.
to answer any questions.
Get back in.
All right, so far we have 3 questions, and they really are kind of I think you've kind of already answered it. The first one though is, will there be a second high school or middle school needed to be built? Based on your projections, even at the high end, it looks like the middle school and the high school are not the schools that we're really going to see that increased growth, that we may not have to worry about that. Am I correct?
Yeah. So let me go back to the by school. I think looking at the historic kind of helps set a good benchmark. So at the middle school level in green here, we're projecting a peak of about 900 students. We only looked back at about 10 years of historic enrollment, but back in 2013, you were at about 880. At the high school, we're projecting a peak of about 1,140, which is below the peak over the prior 10 years. And we understand that enrollment was even higher in the mid 2000s and late 2000s. So this doesn't necessarily capture the highest in recent memory.
The second question, and Bob, I'm going to put this out here, is will this affect our taxes?
really kind of early to determine that at this point. I mean, it's, our budgets are going to be shifting and moving over the next 10 years just based upon our current program. It's hard to say right now until we see the actual growth, how it's going to affect our taxes.
Here's another one. You show 6 developments at first and focus on 3. Is that because the other 3 are age-restricted communities or they have not yet been approved?
Sure. So the 6 developments were the properties in the township's fair share housing agreement. Those are not all approved. The fair share housing, process is basically the municipalities need to provide an opportunity for those projects to move forward. 2 of those projects are age restricted. I'm not sure of their approval status, but only 3 have actually gone through the site plan and subdivision process and received land use approvals from the township. And so we've only included those projects that have received that level of approval.
Mhm.
Dr. Treese, there was a question at the top that we didn't see right away. It's talked about the possibility of redistricting to reduce a load on Bear Tavern. And I think we could obviously say we're going to look at all of those kinds of things to make sure that our class sizes remain, equal throughout the district.
Yes, and I was going to go back to that one, and that appears in another question further down about redistricting. Everything is on the table for us to consider before we go to considering building on, in addition to looking at building on to Bear Tavern. If you all remember, some members of the community that have been around, when we looked at how these possible developments were going to affect the district some years ago when Dr. Smith was here, the former superintendent, we looked at redistricting in a couple different ways. And we knew that the impact would probably be on Bear Tavern and perhaps Stony Brook. And there were plans at the time to increase the size of Bear Tavern and I believe Stony Brook. We will have to revisit those plans at this point to see, how that's changed over the years. But the first plan of attack before building a whole new school, of course, would be probably to redistrict, to send some students off to where there is space in the district to maintain class size as best we can, and then look to rebuild or build onto Bear Tavern. And there were initial plans for that. Now that would be happening over the course of a school year. So the earlier we can start planning this while there is room to do that in the building, the better. We're also looking at building usage studies and reports. Those are already underway, as well as how this will affect transportation. That will be something we'll have to do. We'll have to do another transportation study to see what that would look like to redistrict students to other parts of the school district. Bob, do you see another question there?
There's a question in there. I'm not sure if Pat and Mike could figure that one. It says, does your projection include foster adoptions and divorced residents who may also have children attending, or do your projections only include state or census numbers?
Sure. So we don't get into that level of detail. The data that's used to develop the projections and those persistency ratios we showed are actual in historical enrollments from the school district. And so any of those populations are included in those enrollment numbers that the district provided us.
I see a question about the ability to absorb students at the middle and high school. Again, the middle school and high school are under enrolled at this time. We do have a very, very nice class size. We will probably see an increase in class size at the middle and high school. There's not enough growth to warrant us building another school, I don't think, for either one of those buildings, and the cost that would be to the taxpayers, the community, the township, if they were going to support us on this, as they've shared that they would do in the past. We'd have to really look at the usage of how we're using the spaces to make sure that we're absorbing students. However, even with the projections, we are under, I believe, what the schools have held in the past. Is that correct, Mr. Calavita?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so we should
I would agree with that.
We should be in a good place with those buildings. We are looking at how that's going to affect our elementary schools, however.
Those buildings, the middle and the high school, are not growing to the point of where they were. They're not even, I think even after this is all through, we're not going to be at the level that the high school was at, in the early 2000s, which was over 1,200 students, almost 1,250, 1,275 students. We're not going to get to that level. And I think the high school is in good shape right now to be able to handle, where we are. We're not going to go much higher than where we are now. There are many questions in there about the elementary schools in class size, and I think we're going to do our best to maintain class sizes according to board policy. And we are going to see how best we can move students around the district to fill the spaces that we have already allotted. What we don't want to do is we don't want to do regular moving around. We want to take a long, hard look at it, where the kids are going to be coming, and make one move, maybe make one sweeping move and that will be it'll stay that way for 10 years while we examine this growth. But we do, we are conscious of class size. We, as you mentioned, Dr. Treese, we did do a not a feasibility study, a usage study of our buildings. And there are ways that we can utilize our classroom spaces perhaps more effectively when we take a good hard look at them. We have some rooms that we could repurpose. We have to get more kids into spaces and preserve our program. So that's the thing that we're going to be doing in the short term, is looking at those types of areas to be prepare for the beginning of increased enrollment.
I see a question about a study on childcare facilities in the area that was not included in the study, but thank you for that question. That is something we will have to add to our list of things to look at as we move forward. And then there was a question about why are the developers not required to expand existing schools? Again, the school district has no purview or ability to require that of the developers. All we can do is continue to work collaboratively with Hopewell Township, and they have worked with us up until this point. They helped bring this study to you, and they help pay for the cost of this, and they have expressed their commitment to support us moving forward. But beyond that, we really can't require that of the developer. Did I miss any questions, Bob, as we were going through?
There was, what are class sizes according to board policy is one. I believe it's 21 to 23 at the elementary K-2 level and 23 to 25 at the secondary level.
And currently we are below that.
Well below that.
Well below that right now on average. So
there's also a question about under enrollment of schools, or which schools are under enrolled. I mean, I think all of our schools are within capacity. There's a functional capacity of every school, and all of our buildings right now are within functional capacity, and there's room for students to be added to all those schools. I don't have the, I don't have the numbers in front of me of how over enrolled. We can put that into the FAQ later on, but they are all within functional capacity at this point.
Tollgate's always an outlier. I mean, we run into space issues at Tollgate because it's such a small building. But that, quite frankly, has happened in the past. That happens on occasion where we have a family move in and that particular grade is maxed out, and we've had to send them off to another school. But beyond that, the other 3 elementary schools are really in a good place right now.
What is the district's current staffing level of teachers relative to target levels? There is a concern regarding teacher shortages and growing enrollment.
We enjoy a very comfortable small class size, quite frankly, class size that's smaller than our surrounding districts. So that is something that beyond the developments that are coming, that we have to look at very closely moving forward. Right now, we are fully staffed and we don't have open positions as other districts do. So currently we are in a good place.
There's a question for Mike and Pat. It said, how can we trust your data if the pandemic picks were not considered? After the pandemic, the world significantly changed, so all new trend projections and analysis are required to be re-engineered. So how are you planning to update and incorporate this into your data?
Yeah, Bob, I'd be happy to get us started with that one. And Pat, if you want to chime in. The only thing that really didn't get captured was the overall census counts, and we really don't rely on that other than for some larger context. The analysis that Pat and I worked on, including the new to district students, looking at the local housing and looking at the change in migration patterns and immigration through those persistency ratios, definitely captured the movement of individuals that were driven largely by the pandemic. We also quickly saw that movement and the result of the changes in the housing market in the 2022 numbers, and sort of that slowdown that Pat had discussed earlier in those new to district students. So our analysis definitely captured that. It's just that larger scale data that sets up the context from the census. I just like to caveat that did not capture the pandemic, just due to the timing of the 10-year census and when it was fielded.
I see a question here about advance notice about redistricting. Again, we haven't decided that that's where we're going. However, if that is where we decide to go, and this would be something that would be done with a planning committee, we wouldn't just do this unilaterally without including the public in that conversation, as we had planning committees in the past. And then people would be given plenty of notice, and we would also have to factor in transportation. Transportation would need to be provided to students in a way that didn't have them on the bus for unreasonable amount of time. So all that would have to be done in advance, and we would communicate that with the public. I know how it is living in a community where you get the card in the mail 2 months before school starts saying, oh, your kid's not going there, they're going here. That's not how we operate in Hopewell. We will be giving you plenty of advance notice if we decide to go that route.
For Mike and Pat, I do not understand how the increased enrollment numbers due to the development in the elementary school will not affect the middle and high school. I heard historic numbers for middle and high school, but what is projected growth for these schools due to the development?
Yeah, so that's a good comment. So we are anticipating students from those new developments enrolling in the middle and high school. I apologize if I maybe didn't make that clear earlier. I think what would be helpful, and this is something we'll provide to the district, is a breakdown for each school. With that bar chart showing the green growth versus the red growth, the natural growth versus the new housing growth. We'll provide a breakdown for each school that'll summarize that.
And Pat, I just happen to have that open up, and I'm just looking at, do I have the numbers generated? Oh, for grades 6 through 8, we're looking at about 80, and grades 9 through 12, we're looking at about 120. So it's not that there's none, we just didn't provide a lot of focus on it.
And that is that from the is that at final build out?
Yes, that's full build out.
Yeah, so that all those students aren't necessarily in the 10-year projections, but we are certainly adding a share of those based on what we anticipate will be built in the 10 years.
Okay.
Only one I think we may not have touched on is the traffic study question.
Right, we will certainly be looking at, as I think Dr. Treese did mention, that we will be looking into another traffic study, working with our transportation department to see what the impact would be if we had to move, folks from, the Bear Tavern area to, say, Stony Brook to pick up some of the slack. But that's going to be a more in-depth analysis, but we will be relooking at traffic. There is a comment here that said, if the study was paid for by the builders, can we trust the results? Study was not paid for by the builders. It was a joint effort between the district and Hopewell Township, shared the cost of the study. Are we concerned about teacher shortages, or some talk about the need for increases in staffing and teacher shortages being able to handle that? I think we are, as Dr. Tree said, at this point in time, our class sizes are extremely favorable. And we seem at this point, we should be able to absorb a decent amount of students without having to worry about that.
I saw a question about concern about the middle and high school maybe losing opportunities for electives. That really shouldn't be affected, because how we decide what electives we keep or not are based on not having enough students, not having too many, and also finding teachers that are able to teach. Like, we know Chinese has been a struggle because it's difficult to find Chinese teachers. So we had to eliminate programming at the middle school and kind of consolidate because of that. But if there's students that are interested in the programming and we have the staff available, those courses will run. All right, anything else?
Again, there are a few other questions in there about redistricting, but I think you covered the majority of it, that, you know, this is going to be, before anything's done regarding redistricting, it's going to be studied, you know, in great detail.
Absolutely.
We understand that there is an emotional tie to certain schools, and we don't want to, you know, we don't want to cause any more harm than would be necessary in that, and that's necessarily be a bad thing. But we want to make sure that all of our schools are, you know, populated equally and fairly throughout the district.
Okay, so we're approaching the end of the hour. Did we miss anything before? And anything that we may have missed, I am going to be downloading the chat and make sure that we answer these questions and get out a FAQ after today's session.
There's one other question that came up regarding to bedrooms. It just says, would you please explain the number of students overall expected with regards to the 2, 3, and 4 bedroom units that will be built? On the slide, I thought it said 447 kids, but there are about 1,600 units for those multi-bedroom units. I thought I saw 191 4-bedroom and would assume about 2 children just from them. Could you is there any way to clarify some of those numbers, guys?
Sure. So I could talk a little bit about kind of the standard methodology. So Rutgers University Center for Urban Policy Research conducted a study. I believe the latest one was 2016, looking at statewide all new developments that were built by bedroom count and price point, and identified the number of students per unit. And so that's what was that's the number, the student generation rate that was used here, and really that's the gold standard for this type of work. And really it reflects the many different types of households that are going to move into these new developments. Will there be families with 2 children moving into a 4-bedroom unit? Absolutely. But that may also be offset by, you know, a family without children perhaps moving into them. So certainly the larger the more bedrooms, the more children we expect to see. But it's important to keep in mind that there's also a large number of families with no school-age children who are going to be moving to development that's going to be offsetting, you know, those families that do.
Yeah, and Pat, I'll just add to that too. I think Hopewell Park is the one that had the 4 bedrooms. I believe it was just about 194 bedrooms at Hopewell Park. Just to recall back on slide 19, that was a 15-year total build-out period, and we assumed about 60% would be occupied within that 10-year horizon for our projection. So we looked at it proportionally of all those total number of units in that 15-year horizon, and we're not saying all 191 are going to be built within the next 10 years and generate students that show up within our 10-year projection. We know that that's a much longer project than we're going to see, you know, within that 10-year projection.
Okay, and there was a final comment. I think Dr. Treese might have mentioned it. Will the PowerPoint be posted on the district website? Yes, it will, as long as well as the recording.
And there was one final statement where a member of the audience was saying that it's really not about emotion. They just are concerned that we're focused on the current status and not the future. We are looking ahead at the future, and based upon the numbers we have right now and us looking at our building usage, we are going to be okay for some time. And we need to plan for some unhoused students, meaning there's not enough room going to, you know, at the end of all of this. At Bear Tavern, that's the school that right now is most affected by the increase. All the schools are seeing an increase, and we have been seeing a steady decrease for years. So, you know, there is room for growth. We have had more students in our schools, and we were comfortably housing those students over the last decades. So there is room for growth, and we use our buildings quite differently than we did back then. So we have to think about the space we have now, the requirements of certain rooms like preschool and kindergarten, they need restrooms. Those are things that we can do but preemptively, before we get into having to add an addition to Bear Tavern, and we're probably gonna have to add an addition to Bear Tavern the way things look. And we may have to reroute some students in the meantime while we're looking at that growth. That's what we're looking at right now, and that's gonna take a lot of planning and a lot more research than is provided by the gentleman here. But I think we have a good place to start. Right, so I'm seeing we're coming to an end here. So again, we will post this power slide deck and the video, and as well as the some responses to the questions that were here for the greater good. And we will keep you abreast of all future studies and keep you informed as we go along. And there will be opportunities for community members to help us in the planning as we move forward, because we do want you a part of that process, as we always have included our community in those decisions. Okay, any closing remarks from our board president or any other folks on the panel?
Just want to thank you again, gentlemen, for joining us and taking our questions. And to the community, thank you all for who were, joined us and able to stay on and ask questions. We just continue to want to acknowledge that every decision we make starts with information and data. And so we're well on our way to knowing some things that will help us establish a plan, right? And to incorporate the community in that process. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your questions. And we'll continue to be in communication through the administration and with the support of the school board.
Yes, and thank you to the township for again bringing us this, helping us bring this first report to the community, and for your continued collaboration and support with any projects we have moving forward, as you've shared that you're willing to work with us to make sure that this has the least impact on the community fiscally as we can possibly do. All right, thank you and have a great evening.
Good evening.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.